The air in Whitehall Palace was thick with a stench so overpowering that hardened courtiers gagged and stumbled to the windows, desperate for air. Outside, stray dogs pawed and licked at the foul liquid seeping through the floorboards. England's once golden prince, King Henry VIII, lay in his chambers, a bloated, decaying mass of flesh and power. What really killed him? You've been told it was simply obesity, gluttony, or just natural causes. But the truth, hidden for centuries, is far darker, far more grotesque. Newly uncovered physician notes and forensic studies of his remains reveal a death so horrifying, it makes the acts that claimed Anne Boleyn look merciful by comparison. Because Henry VIII didn't just die, he rotted alive. His body poisoned from within, his mind shattered by toxins, his flesh literally bursting apart in the days after his death. The shocking medical truth was deliberately buried by his terrified government, desperate to preserve the illusion of royal dignity. But today, we're dragging it back into the light, and trust me, you've never heard Henry's story told like this before. But before we peel back the rotting layers of his final days, let's rewind. Because Henry wasn't always the grotesque tyrant history remembers. Once, he was Europe's golden prince. Athletic, charming, educated, the very image of Renaissance majesty. So how did that young king transform into a 400-pound monster whose very corpse horrified his nation? It all began with a single catastrophic event. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. A tournament that would change England forever. The tilt yard at Greenwich thundered with anticipation. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, straining for a glimpse of their king. Henry VIII, then 44, still cut a magnificent figure, broad-shouldered, towering, the embodiment of royal vigor. Clad in gilded armor worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime, he mounted his colossal war-horse, the ground itself trembling beneath them. The trumpet blast signaled the charge. Henry leveled his lance, eyes locked on his opponent. Two armored titans thundered toward each other with the raw force of a modern car crash. But then, the unthinkable. The horses collided awkwardly. Henry, a massive 300 pounds in steel and flesh, was thrown violently from the saddle. Before the stunned crowd could react, his war-horse stumbled and, in a sickening twist of fate, collapsed directly on top of its king. Gasps turned to horrified silence. For 2 long hours, England had no monarch. Henry lay unconscious, sprawled on the frozen earth. His queen, Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant with the male heir that might secure her future, waited in agony for news. 2 hours where the Tudor dynasty hung by a thread. When Henry finally stirred, witnesses knew something had changed forever. The bright, witty prince who could dance until dawn, compose music, and debate theology with Europe's sharpest minds. He never truly returned from that tilt yard. His eyes burned with a new, unsettling volatility. His first words weren't gratitude for surviving, but rage, fury that the tournament had been stopped. Modern neuroscientists, analyzing historical accounts, now believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury, likely to the frontal lobe, the very region governing impulse control, reason, and personality. And the consequences were devastating. The executions, the paranoia, the notorious rages, they all trace back to that single catastrophic blow. But the head injury was only the beginning of Henry's descent. That same accident reopened an older wound on his leg, a seemingly minor injury from years before. This time it refused to heal. In a world without antibiotics, an open wound was not just painful, it was a slow-motion death sentence. Imagine living day after day with ulcers the size of tennis balls carved into both legs. Not for weeks, not for months, for 11 agonizing years. These weren't scabs or scratches. They were gaping sores that oozed pus so foul it forced even hardened courtiers to gag. The king's physicians drained them daily, sometimes twice, filling bronze basins with infected fluid that servants hurried away, praying the stench wouldn't linger in their hair and clothes. Dr. Thomas Vicari, Henry's chief physician, secretly described the ulcers as stinking and grievous beyond measure. But Henry, in his pride, tried to mask the horror. He ordered special bandages laced with lead weights to press the wound shut, only making the infection worse. He drenched himself in imported perfumes, hoping to conceal the smell of rotting flesh. And he demanded that painters portray him with strong, athletic legs, a monumental lie that has fooled history books for centuries. But vanity couldn't hide the truth. The infection wasn't just in his legs anymore. Every day, toxins seeped into his bloodstream, attacking his heart, his liver, and most terrifyingly, his brain. The very organs that once fueled his charm and intellect were now being eaten alive from the inside. The golden Renaissance prince was gone. In his place stood a man poisoned by his own body, consumed by constant pain, and driven to madness by infections science wouldn't understand for another 400 years. By the late 1530s, the leg ulcers weren't just crippling Henry's body. They were warping his mind. The constant flood of toxins entering his bloodstream created waves of fever, delirium, and neurological damage. His mood swung violently, not from choice, but from chemistry. One moment he wept like a broken child, the next he screamed for executions. Servants whispered of his rages, describing him as unpredictable, terrifying. Ministers entered his presence like gamblers rolling dice. Would they face the charming, witty monarch of old, or the tyrant whose temper could end their lives with a single word? Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's most trusted advisor, learned the answer the hard way. Within a few short years of the accident, he went from Henry's right hand to the chopping block. Even Henry's marriages bore the scars of his poisoned mind. Before the accident, he had endured 20 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon with relatively few executions. But after 1536, Anne Boleyn lost her head within months. Catherine Howard, barely 17 when Henry married her, followed soon after. His paranoia fixated on betrayal, adultery, and imagined plots. To be near the king was no longer an honor. It was a death sentence waiting to be signed. And yet the physical agony never stopped. His legs oozed constantly, the pain so sharp that silk bed sheets brushing against the sores could make him scream. His sighs ballooned as immobility and endless feasting compounded his misery. By the 1540s, armor that once fit snugly around a strong waist now required extensions of 6, then 8, then 10 extra inches. The once athletic monarch had transformed into something monstrous, a king both feared and pitied, ruling from a throne that smelled of rot. By the early 1540s, Henry's body had become its own prison. Once a warrior who could joust for hours, he was now so obese that even standing required assistance. His waistline, once powerful and lean, swelled beyond imagination. His preserved armor tells the tale. A 48-inch waist in 1540 stretched to a staggering 54 inches just 5 years later. That's wider than many modern refrigerators. But the weight was only part of the horror. The palace itself had to be reshaped to contain the king. Doorways at Hampton Court were widened to accommodate his bulk. Floors were reinforced with extra beams after his sheer mass caused them to sag dangerously. Carpenters constructed special chairs with removable arms so he could squeeze into them. Even his clothing was modified with hidden seams to disguise his ever-expanding girth. The morning ritual of dressing, Henry turned into a military operation. He could no longer rise from bed unassisted, so pulleys and slings were installed to lift him upright. 4 servants would maneuver his swollen legs into position, while others strapped him into a wheeled chair disguised as a portable throne. To the public, he appeared regal, seated in majesty. In reality, the King of England had become almost immobile, propped up like a decaying relic. And the smell. No amount of perfume could mask it. Courtiers began carrying pomanders, small balls filled with herbs and spices, pressed to their noses whenever summoned. Some ladies fainted during audiences, their delicate stomachs unable to withstand the reek of rot. Still, Henry demanded obedience. Anyone who dared flinch, gag, or recoil at his presence risked banishment, or worse. The Tudor court, once a glittering Renaissance spectacle, had devolved into a theatre of horror where the king's very body dictated the rhythm of government. By 1544, Henry's condition was no longer just physical. It had become psychological torment. His court chroniclers, ambassadors, even his closest servants began whispering about visions, delusions, and outbursts that chilled them to the bone. At times, he raged at invisible enemies, shouting at empty chairs or screaming at ghosts only he could see. One ambassador described a state council suddenly freezing as Henry bellowed at Anne Boleyn's phantom, pointing to a corner of the chamber and shrieking, "I took your head once, I'll take it again." A moment later, he collapsed into his chair, resuming business as though nothing had happened. His paranoia reached grotesque levels. Convinced his servants were poisoning him through his bandages, he demanded they present the pus-soaked dressings for his personal inspection. Witnesses described the king sniffing his own infected wrappings before allowing them to be burned. He forced food tasters to sample not only his meals, but his medicines, even ointments, compelling them to smear salves on their own skin first to prove they weren't poisoned. And yet the court dared not laugh, nor recoil, nor even exchange glances. Every face wore the mask of loyalty, though behind the mask was terror. Pages devised secret signals to warn courtiers of the king's mood. A red ribbon for rage, black for depression, white for the rare moments of calm. Even with this system, mistakes proved deadly. A servant who sneezed in Henry's presence was dragged away as a suspected assassin. A lady who accidentally stepped on his robe saw her family stripped of lands and titles. The Tudor court had transformed into a place where silence, obedience, and absolute submission were the only survival tools. England was ruled by a man who reeked of decay, believed in ghosts, and wielded execution as casually as conversation. By Christmas 1546, the King of England was barely recognizable as human. Chroniclers described him as a swollen mass of flesh, slumped on his throne, unable to rise without 6 men hauling him upright. His once bright blue eyes had yellowed, sunken deep within pouches of mottled flesh. His face, nearly doubled in size from grotesque fluid retention, had taken on a jaundiced, almost inhuman mask. The ulcers that had plagued him for over a decade now spread beyond control. Dr. Thomas Wendy's private notes, suppressed for centuries, recorded wounds so deep the bone itself was visible. Gangrene had set in, the skin blackened, the smell unbearable. Servants fainted during routine bandage changes. Windows were left open in the dead of winter because the stench was so overpowering it filled entire chambers within minutes. And yet, Henry still clung to ritual and pretense. He commanded painters to immortalize him as strong and defiant, hiding the reality that he could scarcely move. His most famous portrait, the Whitehall image, was later discovered, through X-ray examination in 1960, to have been altered. Originally, Henry was painted gripping a cane topped with a human skull. Obsessed with death, he carried this morbid staff everywhere, tapping it nervously against the floor during audiences. But after his death, his son Edward VI ordered it painted over, desperate to hide the truth of his father's decline. His mind followed his body into collapse. Henry often spoke to ghosts, including his long-dead parents and wives. He accused counselors of betrayal, sometimes ordering executions of men who had already been dead for years. The great king who once defied the Pope now lived in a nightmare of paranoia and hallucinations, trapped in a body that was rotting around him. January 1547. Whitehall Palace. Henry's body had become a battlefield of infection and decay. His kidneys, overwhelmed by years of toxins, began to fail. His urine, when he could pass any at all, was thick, dark, and foul-smelling. His abdomen swelled with fluid, pressing on his organs until even breathing was labor. His tongue ballooned grotesquely, his speech reduced to wet, gurgling sounds that only his closest attendants could decipher. By mid-January, he could no longer walk, nor even sit upright without slings and pulleys. Bed sores developed on his massive frame, oozing alongside the ulcers that had devoured his legs. 6 men were required just to roll him in bed, their faces wrapped in cloths to endure the stench. The mighty King of England was reduced to a wheezing, yellow-skinned husk, drowning in his own rot. His mental state swung wildly between clarity and madness. In lucid moments, Henry begged his physicians to save him, offering wealth and power if they could halt the decay. But medicine was helpless against gangrene and organ failure. When hope slipped, his terror returned. He called out for his dead mother, Elizabeth of York, sobbing like a child. He whispered apologies to his brother Arthur, whose throne and wife he had claimed. Most pitifully, he called for Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had cast aside decades earlier, begging her forgiveness as death closed in. On the night of January 27th, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to administer last rites. What he recorded in his private diary, hidden for centuries, paints the most harrowing picture of all. Henry thrashed violently in seizures, 6 men holding down his vast frame as he vomited black bile. The smell drove attendants from the room, but Cranmer endured to witness the king's final moments. Near 2 a.m. on January 28, 1547, Henry's breathing shifted into the dreaded sound physicians call the death rattle, a wet, gurgling gasp as his lungs filled with fluid. Archbishop Cranmer, kneeling at his bedside, urged the king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. Too weak to speak, Henry squeezed the archbishop's hand once, feebly. Minutes later, his swollen fingers slackened. England's most powerful monarch was dead. But what followed was almost more horrifying than the death itself. His body, ravaged by years of infection, decomposed with shocking speed. Within hours, his already bloated frame began to swell grotesquely as gases from bacterial rot filled the corpse. The stench intensified beyond endurance. Servants retched in the hallways. Windows stood wide open against the freezing January air, yet it barely helped. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made a chilling decision. Henry's death would be kept secret for 3 days. Officially, the king was resting. In reality, embalmers were racing against time to contain a body that was already falling apart. When they opened him, the truth was undeniable. His liver was enlarged and crumbling, his intestines black with gangrene, his heart swollen and surrounded by fluid. The stomach released such a wave of stench that one assistant fainted on the spot. Desperately, they packed his corpse with 100 pounds of salt and herbs, wrapped it in wax cloth drenched in turpentine, and sealed it inside a reinforced lead coffin. But even that couldn't stop the decomposition. During the lying in state, horrified witnesses reported bulges forming in the coffin as gases built inside. Pops, cracks, and gurgles echoed through the chamber, the grotesque soundtrack of England's monarch continuing to rot. 2 weeks after Henry's death, his massive coffin began its slow, grim journey to Windsor Castle. Weighing nearly half a ton with its lead lining, it required 8 horses to drag it through the frozen, muddy roads. Progress was slow. The procession that should have taken a day stretched into 3. On the second night, the cortege stopped at Sion Abbey, ironically, one of the very monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was set in the chapel for the night. That's when the horror began. Under the immense pressure of gas building inside the corpse, the lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses compared to a thunderclap. Putrid black fluid seeped onto the chapel floor, filling the sacred space with a stench so unbearable that guards fled their posts. And then came the indignity that turned a king into carrion. By morning, attendants discovered dogs had crept into the chapel during the night. The animals had been licking the fluids that leaked from the coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed ruler of England, the king who broke with Rome, who executed wives, who reshaped a nation, ended up as food for stray dogs. Panic seized the attendants. Sawdust and lime were thrown down to soak up the remains. The coffin was hastily resealed, layers of lead hammered over the bulging seams. But the damage to Henry's dignity was irreparable. Whispers of the desecration spread, carried by foreign diplomats and horrified witnesses. For centuries afterward, the incident at Sion Abbey would survive in legend because it was simply too grotesque to forget. When the procession finally reached Windsor, Henry was buried quickly, stripped of the elaborate pomp once planned. His final exit from this world was not regal. It was obscene. When Henry's bloated coffin finally arrived at Windsor Castle on February 14th, the Privy Council abandoned plans for the grand spectacle once envisioned. Instead of a glorious farewell for one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, the burial was hurried and subdued. The stench leaking from the coffin made any prolonged ceremony impossible. Priests chanted hurried prayers while laborers lowered the monstrous casket into the vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The once golden prince of Christendom was entombed with none of the dignity he had demanded in life. Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, issued a ruthless order: absolute silence. Every witness to the decomposition, every servant who had smelled the rot, every courtier who had seen the coffin split at Sion Abbey was sworn to secrecy on pain of death. The official record declared Henry VIII had passed peacefully and been buried with all proper honors. No mention of the stench, no mention of the coffin bursting, no mention of the dogs. For generations, the grotesque truth was buried as deeply as the king himself. Portraits continued to show him standing defiantly, legs spread, hand on hip, radiating strength. Historians repeated the official story. He had died overweight, yes, but otherwise without scandal. Only scattered foreign reports and private diaries whispered the reality, that England's most feared king had died rotting from the inside out, abandoned and hidden away in shame. And perhaps most tragically, Henry now lies not in the monumental tomb he once designed for himself, but in an unmarked grave. Beneath St. George's Chapel, his coffin rests beside Jane Seymour, the only wife to give him a son. The mighty king who defied the Pope, who terrorized his nation, lies in anonymity, sealed in silence, his dignity lost forever. So what does Henry VIII's grotesque death truly mean for history? It's tempting to dismiss it as simple karma. The tyrant who executed wives, dissolved monasteries, and terrorized his nation, reduced to a stinking ruin. But the reality is far more revealing. His decline shows us the raw fragility of power, how even a man who reshaped Europe with a stroke of his pen could not escape the slow torture of his own failing flesh. For centuries, historians smoothed over the story. They called him obese, gluttonous, paranoid. But those words sanitize what really happened. The king didn't just grow fat. He didn't just lose his temper. He lived and died in a nightmare of chronic infection, neurological damage, and organ failure. His every decision, from executing Anne Boleyn to marrying teenage Catherine Howard, was shaped by the poisons seeping from his rotting body. The Tudor dynasty itself was warped by the pus that dripped from his ulcers. And yet the government's cover-up worked. For nearly 450 years, the official line painted Henry's death as peaceful, dignified, even ordinary. Only through unearthed physician notes, forensic examinations, and the whispered accounts of those who witnessed his last days has the truth emerged. Henry VIII died screaming, rotting, and exploding from within. This isn't just grisly detail. It's history that changes how we understand one of the most infamous kings in the world. It reminds us that behind the portraits, behind the power, behind the legend, there was a man, and that man's body betrayed him in the most horrifying way imaginable. And that is the real, unvarnished story of Henry VIII's death. Not the sanitized version fed to classrooms and textbooks, but the raw, disturbing truth his government tried to erase. The king who once struck fear into an entire continent ended his life, bloated, delirious, and decomposing faster than embalmers could contain. His corpse burst open, his remains desecrated by dogs, his dignity obliterated. For all his wealth, power, and ruthlessness, Henry VIII could not escape the one truth no monarch can rewrite. Death comes for us all, and it does not negotiate. When you think of Henry now, don't picture the defiant stance of his portraits, the hand on hip, the legs spread in dominance. Picture instead the gasping, broken man begging forgiveness from wives he had discarded, screaming at ghosts that haunted his chamber and rotting so quickly that even his coffin could not hold him. That is the king behind the myth. That is the Tudor tyrant stripped of his illusions. If this journey into the darkest chapter of Tudor history shocked you, trust me, there are more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. Next, you'll want to see my investigation into Anne Boleyn's execution, and the French spy connection that changes everything you thought you knew about why she really lost her head. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join the community uncovering the suppressed corners of history. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was Henry's gruesome death poetic justice, or a tragedy that shows just how human even kings really are? And don't forget to like this video so more history fans can discover the truth buried for centuries. Because here, we don't just study history, we expose it.